So Brian, over to Brian O'Toole. I'd like to introduce you to our colleague, Brian O'Toole, um, who hails from Ireland and is going to speak to us. He leads up the Law Research Task Group in Renate. And Brian has gathered together some of the tenets of that research, which has been across Europe for the last 18 months, and will take us through some very interesting facts and findings. Just by way of introducing Brian, Brian is the Justice Director with the presentation congregations, and I think Brian has been working with them in that capacity for the last 9 years now, I think, or maybe 10 years. And in that capacity as the Justice Director for Presentation Sisters, he has been keeping the presentation commitments alive in the communities of sisters. In that context, he works to honour and advance the rights and care of the earth, the rights of women and children, and the rights of Indigenous and tribal peoples. Much of the work that Brian does is done in collaboration with others. And in that regard, he has particular actions in relation to the Africa Faith and Justice Network. He also he's the leader of the Law Task Research Group. He is the treasurer for ACT Ireland, that's the Act to Prevent Trafficking in Ireland. And of course, he's involved in drawing up numerous documents, reports, input to the NRMs, and if you want a task done and you want somebody to gather all the pieces of the puzzle, not only put them together, but create a great tapestry at the end of it all, Brian is the person. So he's blushing here now as I'm giving this little introduction. But it's a very small little intro for a person who has great generous heart and works very hard for our work with Renate. So over to you, Brian, and you'll share your own screen. Thank you.
Can you see that, Anne?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. No, it's working. Thanks, Anne, and thanks indeed for the lovely introduction. And I have to say, I'm bowled over by the presentation that was just before me with Felicia involved. And it really showed us exactly how vulnerable people can be. And really the one thing that I took from it is that a victim of human trafficking who has been identified is a vulnerable person who has been made more vulnerable. So the question for us in the Law Task Group was, how exactly can we support identified victims? What can we do in order to assist them by way of advice or expertise, or making sure they get their entitlements and that their rights are respected? And I listened back to what Mary said at the very beginning, that Renate behaves in a way that is trauma-informed and victim-centred. And that's very much, if you like, at the core of the Law Task Group and the original research that we undertook. And the original research that we undertook was a mapping exercise, essentially, where we looked at 6 different countries. We looked at Albania, Bulgaria, England and Wales, Spain, Germany, and Spain, Germany, Bulgaria. I think I named them all. I'll come back in case I haven't. I think I've named them all. But in those 6 countries, we did kind of a mapping exercise to see exactly what were the if you like, the available services for people, and effectively how difficult was it so that victims might get their various entitlements or understand exactly what they were entitled to. At the very beginning, Eilish mentioned COVID, and maybe just to show you how complex a case can get very quickly. COVID brought about a particular scenario where people were pushed into isolation and victims were pushed into further isolation. But perpetrators very quickly took up the mantle of using technology. So it could happen, I suppose, therefore, that a perpetrator using technology, he can live in one country, he can recruit and control victims from another country, advertise for customers in a third country, and maybe even bank the profits of what he's earned in a fourth country. And there's good reason for using all of those countries. He's at a distance, the perpetrator's at a distance, But if it's a case that the laws in one country are weak, then what the perpetrator is doing is exploiting the differences between the laws in one country and another. And inside in those, if you like, those weaknesses is where human trafficking can thrive from the point of view of the perpetrator trying to do his worst. So what is becoming more and more apparent or more important in terms of what we're finding out is that the scourge of human trafficking is growing, but that the numbers of those who can legally support and advise victims is decreasing. And therefore, what's actually happening is there is now a perfect storm developing in such a way that perpetrators can act with even greater impunity because of the fact that the legal entitlements and what is there to protect victims is weakening. And some of the states that are involved in terms of presenting legislation, they, to some extent, may even be regarded as being complicit in what is happening. So the first piece of research that we did, you can see the countries there in case I left one out. We looked at what is the quality of support or legal assistance that is available to victims of human trafficking. We also looked at the access. Is it easy to access this? And what about awareness? Are victims of human trafficking aware of their rights? And really what we were finding out was that they're not. And in fairness, how could they be? Because they know very little maybe about the country that they're now in. So how could they be expected to know about their rights in a new country, in a different country? Access to entitlements is something too that they're unsure of. In fact, it is often the case, and has happened quite often, that maybe a victim of human trafficking isn't even aware that they are a victim. So if you might ask, well, why exactly did we do this? Well, we did this, I suppose, really to be able to give some authority to our own experience, to add a credibility to what we knew to be the case, and to move from a point of being able to report anecdotally on what we knew to be the case, to be able to report definitively and with evidence, so that this particular research could be used as a lever to bring about an improvement, or to further make sure that those who are falling further behind are not going to end up in that particular space. In all responding 6 countries, we found that there was very poor victim identification. Now that's key. If a victim has been identified as a victim of human trafficking or modern slavery, once they're identified, there are entitlements that follow on from this until such time as a decision is made with regards to whether or not a country believes this person's application to try to figure out whether or not they have been a victim. So until they get this identification, there is very little that people are entitled to in some of the countries. Some countries are better than others. We definitely found that. We also found that some countries only identify victims in the sex industry. Some countries ignore boys and men altogether. Some countries do not record children as victims. Some countries have no national human trafficking strategy. In a lot of countries, any services that are available are only available in rural areas. In some countries, the state mixes up the whole idea of migration and human trafficking and modern slavery in such a way that the story that is spun means that all of a sudden the victim is now kind of the immigrant, and there may well be an hostile welcome for the immigrant. It appears, therefore, that no responding country in this first piece of research offered that their legal system was truly trauma sensitive. And that was very important to us. So from our point of view, then, we expanded the research, and this is what I'm referring to. We expanded the research about 18 months ago because we wanted to take what was essentially a mapping exercise and to move it on. And we wanted to build on the previous research. But this time, we wanted to engage legal practitioners. Previously, we were looking at those who were maybe providing services, access to service. But this time, we were looking for lawyers or legal advocates or people who would deliver advice, that were allowed to deliver advice, or offer advice to victims of human trafficking. So in the 6 countries, the same 6 countries, we decided we would organize a survey, but also an interview, which is exactly what we did. But what we did find out subsequently, which was really eye-opener to us and was something that we thought was well worth minding and preserving and maybe building upon, is that there is actually a healthy pro bono legal support structure in most of the countries. And this is really important because without the pro bono, as in the free legal advice, because of the good nature and the good-hearted legal systems and the legal advocates that are out there, there would be even less support from many of the victims. However, you cannot depend on a voluntary system to try and make sure that victims of human trafficking, all of them are being looked after. So what we did find out that cases are really complicated, that they're extremely long, and that the assistance to victims of trafficking, namely translation, was an issue, funding was an issue. What we wanted to find out was what other research is out there? What are the best practice examples of what could we learn? And what recommendations we were listening to, that there might be some recommendations. So this is actually ongoing at the minute. And there has been a little bit of a delay. And I'll tell you, there's a good reason for the delay. When we contacted some of the friends that we have, with the people that we know, to say, would you please contribute to the survey? Or would you make yourself available for an interview? They do so, but there is a kind of an intake of breath because people are so busy. Like people who are maybe their working week is 40 hours a week will say, I'm working 80, but I could work 90, 100. So we know it is a big ask, but we depended on the network that Mari described at the very beginning to try and gather a group of advocates to help us begin this research. We have the preliminary findings for Albania, and we have, I suppose, we also have the preliminary findings for the United Kingdom. In Albania, what we did find, and Sister Imelda is working in Albania, as is Aphrodita, who was on earlier on. What we did find is that interpretation is a big issue. We found that the legislation is poorly implemented, even though there is some legislation poorly implemented. The legislation isn't good. It's scattered. It's all over the place. It should be in one place. It should be harmonized. It makes implementation of the legislation really, really difficult. So it makes a case very complicated and very difficult. But there is currently a move to streamline the legislation, and Renata are actually involved in trying to progress this particular movement. The system is overly bureaucratic, so it weighs itself down, it catches itself on. Victims of human trafficking in Albania do not trust the police and they do not trust the courts. And they have good reason maybe not to. It's often a case that there is an ongoing failure of the police to take victims seriously. They might stigmatize them. It's also a case too that the police are regularly moved around. So any policeman who is prepared to take a case, maybe working somewhere else by the time that case comes up for mention or comes up into the court. So there again, it falls. Victims are often re-traumatized. They're often stigmatized. The legal system in Albania has two parts. It has a primary part, which is good because that describes what you're entitled to. That's good. England doesn't have that, and we'll mention England in a minute. But then it has a secondary part, which is about attending in court and representing in court. However, the shelters, like what Aphrodita was talking about a few minutes ago, the shelters are really super because they often have an expertise because they are dealing regularly and quite often with victims of human trafficking. So very often a victim will depend on the trusted shelter and the trusted staff to be able to get good advice. What we did find out in Albania is that the earlier the contact with victims, the better the chances they have of decent help. Also, what we found was being present. There are 73 of you here this evening, but to be present means to sit and listen, to develop an empathy. It's about developing a rapport. And in any countries that in this particular research and the last, what we found was that lawyers said, I had to learn something new. I had to learn how to listen with an empathy. I had to learn to listen with my whole person because I had to develop a sense of trust. I had to wait until the person was ready. And what often happened too was needs emerge not immediately. They may emerge over time. So what began as a relationship knowing a certain amount of information became something different towards the end because the trust had built. It's also, I remember actually one particular advocate had said, I can't meet with the client at 9 in the morning because he'd been so traumatized. He needs to take his his medication, his mental health is fragile. So there's no point in me having a meeting with him at 9 in the morning. He won't hear a word I say. He won't understand what I say. I'm wasting my time. I can only have a meeting with him at 11 o'clock because then I know he's at his best and we can have an hour where we can figure out, but it's very slow work. And that's the issue. Victims are also criminalized, which is not allowed. It's what they call the non-punishment principle. If a victim has broken the law or been forced into a criminal act because they have been trafficked, they're entitled to use that fact as a defense to say, well, I would never have done that ordinarily because I was forced to do it. But they are regularly criminalized. And to be criminalized then adds another layer of legal work to try and sort that bit out. So you can see how trying to help the victim out with regards to their being a victim of human trafficking, that has one layer, but then you may have criminalized, that's another layer. You may also have housing, you may also have immigration and asylum. So there are lots of different layers of the legal frameworks that may be required to help a particular victim. There's very little expertise available also. That is in Albania, which is not as bad in England. The family too of the victim may also need legal advice. And it is also a case too that perhaps the family have been complicit. Maybe it is this person has been trafficked by their own family. So that too is another concern. If a criminal case falls, it's often likely to that a civil case falls. So let's say a victim says, I want to apply for compensation, which doesn't happen that often because it may be a case that the victim might say, I might have to sit in front of them. I might have to see them if I want to apply for compensation. But if a victim applies for compensation, if the criminal case falls against the perpetrator, then the chances are the civil case will fall also too. Much of Albania has no legal cover whatsoever. And very often, those in charge have no training. The judge, the police, they're very little training. So there's no formal training within the legal system for somebody in Albania to learn how to implement the legislation around human trafficking. And similarly with the police. Child victims are not recognised. We asked, what are recommendations for Albania? Well, we wanted more lawyers. We wanted them better funded so that they will be paid a proper rate for looking after victims of human trafficking. It's not an attractive proposition for a lawyer to take on a case. It's too long. It's probably not going to be successful and you'll get very little money for it. You will have to double your workload in order to listen to the person. And it's also quite traumatic. And there are a lot of lawyers who find that the work is so difficult that they will just do it for a short period of time and then move on. There is also an issue of corruption in the country. And as I said at the very beginning, it's also a case too that the legislation needs to be streamlined. So what's really clear in Albania, though, it is becoming easier to be trafficked than it is to be freed from trafficking. And it seems too that if the state doesn't tackle that problem, then they are actually complicit in allowing it to happen. And this is why we're looking for the funds. So what about England and Wales? The preliminary findings there, some similarities definitely with Albania. But there are some eye-opening concerns that are emerging in a country that is providing a very hostile welcome for refugees and asylum seekers. What's worrying really is the conflation of human trafficking and migration and the deliberate blurring of the lines between the two. What lawyers are saying openly is that policy is changing regularly and quickly. And really, in short, what this means is that it's just becoming much more strict. Only yesterday we were listening about Rwanda and listening and hearing how asylum seekers now are going to be paid to go to Rwanda. The government are so desperate to try and show that this policy is working. When victims are discovered in England, they have a decision to make. They either decide to enter the national referral mechanism or they don't. If they enter the national referral mechanism, they're applying to be considered as a victim. There is a chance that they will fail, that they will not be recognised as a victim. And if that happens, all entitlements fall away and they will end up being destitute, as is often the case. But there is no advice for a victim that will tell them that beforehand. But some victims are so hungry, they have no accommodation, they are so mentally fragile, they're so traumatized that they will go along with anything if they thought it was a meal, it was a roof over their head. So they will enter the national referral mechanism in the hope that this will sort out all the problems. And very often it doesn't. In our research, what we found is that lawyers in England and Wales are paid a very low flat rate for their service. They do an awful lot of unpaid work and that there's no formal legislation or no formal training in what is a really large piece of legislation, the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, which is changing all the time. So you would imagine there would be a lot of learning there. Cases are long, unsuccessful. The fee may not be received until the case is over. The case may take years if it gets there. Once a positive decision is received in the National Referral Mechanism, then legal advice can be given around immigration, housing, compensation, and all of these might mean meeting new lawyers. Tell your story again, tell your story again. So the system appears to be designed to wear down the victim and also wear down the lawyer. Lawyers meeting with victims, as we said earlier, must develop an empathy, a new listening. They must support, there must be a support. Often they are a key person in the journey of a survivor. So with that comes a huge responsibility, and they feel that. They say, if I give poor advice, if I'm too short or too quick, or if I don't give enough advice, it has huge ramifications for a victim, which wouldn't be the case if I was dealing with other legislation. And another difficulty for lawyers in England and Albania, wherever they work, they very often have to know more about the legislation of another country, the country from where the victim came from. So there is all of this extra knowledge to know. But there again, there is no, if you like, there's no training for this. So we asked lawyers, where did you get your training? Some said, well, we shadowed other colleagues. Some said, I learned on the job. Would you let a doctor learn on the job? They think it's not good enough, but they do an awful lot of research. It's unpaid. Some of them are working so hard that they feel as though they're cycling in first gear all the time, that they're not getting far, no matter how quick that they're going. They do trust the NGOs in England because they have an expertise. There are very few prosecutions, as we know. And many lawyers claim that they need extra learning. Many of them will apply for, if you like, courses or training elsewhere, that this is what they actually want. However, what they do find is that when they ring another chambers or another lawyer, other lawyers will spend time for free and tell them and inform them and help them. But the other lawyer won't take the case. He's kind of glad you're doing it, and he's delighted you're doing it, and he praise you, he'll help you, but he won't take it on himself. The new Borders and Nationality Bill in England means that even less are now receiving a positive decision remain in the country. So there's a real burnout factor when it comes to lawyers who work some really truly awful cases of man's cruelty to man. And this means that there's an unacceptable attrition rate that reduces the number of lawyers needed to meet the growing number of victims. So this is what I was saying at the very beginning, that the issue, there are now more victims of human trafficking than ever before, but there are less lawyers available to help them get out of the situation. We're hoping that this...
We're cutting out on time, Brian.
Okay. Well, I just want to say, thanks, Anne. I just want to say that this particular piece of legislation, or this research, we hope will be finished by the end of summer. And our call to action to you this evening then is to come back and to listen to and to read. And when we launch the research in the beginning, at the beginning of the summer. So thanks, Anne. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. Much appreciated. That was, I know you could have been there for much longer. I know, because this is a comprehensive piece of research, but our time is flying. Certainly in the context of what you've left with us is an appetite for more information. We really look forward to that research and congratulate all the members of the Law Task Group for their commitment and their ongoing pursuit of the information and the research itself. It's staggering to think, though, that the real scourge is that human trafficking is growing, but legal supports and entitlements are weakening. That is so sobering, and it just made me stop and think, well, where do you go in the face of that? So I suppose in many senses, when it's only right and proper that the foundation stone is victim-centered and human rights-based approach in all the work around anti-human trafficking, and in particular informing the Law Task Group. So thank you, Brian, and colleagues in the task group, and I'm going to move very